don't know long-term what happens if the cattle are gone. So to remove the cattle may actually pose a risk to the toads.
Thank you, Mr. Wooster. Now I'd like to introduce a man who needs no introduction, Tuolumne County County Supervisor Randy Handveld.
Thank you, Congressman. By the way, thank you both for being here. Welcome to Tuolumne County. It's particularly appropriate that you have this hearing here because we are the center of attention, if you will, in the area affected by this. Just a note to my friend, Ms. Pitts, it would be nice if they do that before they propose the designation. Well, I want to talk a little about economics in Tuolumne County, and I'm going to talk mostly about Tuolumne County, but I assure you all the other counties are going to feel the pain, just like we're feeling the pain, or will feel the pain. And contrary to what Ms. Pitts said, and I think I can show that to you, access to the area is the problem, and while they say they won't deny access, the practice is they do. We will be impacted by it because we've seen it before. By the way, before I get started, I want you to all know we love our frogs and toads. And I don't care whether they're yellow-legged or not, and whether Yosemite's in their namesake or not. We love our frogs and our toads, all of them. This is not intended to be frogs versus people or vice versa. So, but every case where critical habitat is mentioned, they take valuable land out of production. If you look at the chart up here, this is their proposal, chart 1, if you can. And I'm just going to speak to my county, but 35% of my county is involved in the designation. Over 500,000 acres. That's a lot of land. Let's put it in perspective for you. That's 785 square miles. Roughly 20 miles by 40 miles. That's a lot of land. That's just in my county. It's 4 times that for the total designation. So really what it comes down to, when they do this, the result will be a smaller timber harvest, less cattle grazing, less recreational opportunity. That means the less fishing, hunting, rafting, hiking, lots of other things, cross-country skiing, snowmobiling, all those things goes along with it. But the list goes further than that. We in Tuolumne County, and I think the other mountain counties affected, are year-round recreational playgrounds and vacation lanes for people. Reduced access to our forests means fewer tourists of all kinds, including ecotourism. Lodging declines, dining declines, tourist shopping declines, our corresponding transient occupancy tax and sales tax goes down, and so local government services go down because that's a significant portion of our general fund money. It just is what it is. We're already stretched and struggling to meet the reasonable basic needs of the people. And on top of that, because these things go down, more businesses go on the threatened list. Maybe I ought to say endangered list. Our highway and road infrastructure is already in sad shape, and it'll only get worse. We need the tourists. Give you an idea that in Tuolumne County, conservatively, tourists put $50 million into our economy last year, and $4 million in TOT and sales tax, probably a little more. I think the other counties can give you the same kind of numbers. We also have a lot of jobs that are generated by the traditional heritage businesses, and they need to survive. Logging has declined for a long time, and I believe it's a direct result of the Forest Service practicing an increased level of what I call active neglect. If we look at the the timber industry alone, Tuolumne County has the best remaining infrastructure in all of California. We have 2 mills, we have a bark plant, a wood shavings plant, 2 biomass power generating plants. And all of these are surviving, not thriving, mostly on a sustainable forest management plan on private land. It's supplemented by what the Forest Service offers us from the public lands, and it's not very much. And I just recently got some information in California, the traditional mining and logging jobs are down 2.6%, while nationally they're up a little bit. We continue to decline. And to say that the infrastructure is struggling to stay alive is, put in mildly, I think it's really on life support. We're, in the state, we're probably 10% or less of the infrastructure we once had, and you need the infrastructure to manage the forest and do it well. You got to take the lumber and the biomass someplace. You got to deal with it. Supervisor Chapman of Trinity County about 2 months ago told me that one of her logging truckers is putting his entire fleet on the auction block. He's out of business because he can't get enough logs, can't get enough business, can't work. He's gone. Once you lose it, it's probably gone forever. It's hard to replace it. Our own wood shavings plant has been only operating intermittently recently for lack of material. Now, if we look at my chart 2, please, you see what the forest grows. I think that's a conservative number. You see what the annual mortality rate is there. It's about 42 million. And the growth is about 225 million. I actually think the number is greater than that. And last year, we didn't pull out very much. We pulled out about 35 million. Now, Congressman McClintock knows this. This year, the original Forest Service plan was 12.5 million. We badgered them to 25 million board feet. To the Congressman, we got him up to 33, only to have him back off to 24 and sell logs and blame it on sequester. We need 40 million minimum to keep our mills operating in an efficient manner. So we take more out, we take more out. If you go to chart 3, please, you see what's been done over roughly the last 20 years, an average of 24 million coming out. In 1990, the volume was 157 million almost. That isn't even keep up with the growth. We need to do those things. So, pardon? Okay. Well, look, forestry is a problem. But I've got a series of charts which I think I've given you that shows how the Forest Service manages the forest. They just keep taking more out, and they take near natural lands out. They take all sorts of things. There isn't a lot of forest left. We're going to take some more land out in this proposal. And if that isn't bad enough, we have other things. We have a huge safety risk in our forest because we have a fire now. But as you don't manage the forest, and we won't manage the critical habitat for the frogs either, the safety risk goes up. Our people pay more for their fire insurance, or they get denied fire insurance. That's happening as we speak. Our water delivery infrastructure is an old, archaic ditch and wooden flume system. If we lose that, we got 3 days water. Forest fire is a problem. And when you take it out, it doesn't work for us. My friend already mentioned traditional cattle grazing, and that's a problem. It puts pressure on them. 40% of their feed comes from forest, being in the high country, and I think they actually help them, the meadows. So where's the upside? It really comes down to this. Our people are losing economically. Our county's losing economically. Our schools are in decline because people are moving out. There aren't any jobs. The cost of living is going up. Our population is declining. We're actually geriatrifying. I think that's a word I made up, our local society, because the young people are leaving. And the people in the rural counties are not thriving. They're becoming endangered. So what happens, and I promise you, the Forest Service will take the critical habitat for the frog out of the game. Now, we're not going to give up. We're not going to abandon ship. It's our lives, it's our families, it's our livelihoods, and it's our backyards. And it's our wildlife that are at stake, and we want it all because we once had it all. Okay? And I think we can have it again by just managing this thing actively and dealing with real cause and effect. Like one of my friends said earlier, we're not dealing with a cause, we're just doing something random that will not make the impact it needs to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Next is Mr. Mark Baird, who's traveled all the way from Siskiyou County to join us today to talk about impacts.
Congressman, thank you very much for inviting me here to speak. I really appreciate the opportunity, and so do the people of Siskiyou County. My name is Mark Baird. I'm the president of Scott Valley Protect Our Water. I'm also a rancher, small business owner, reserve deputy sheriff, and resident of Siskiyou County. We're the point of the spear for the environmental agenda. Just about every environmental social engineering project we face today began in Siskiyou County. It's still going on. Siskiyou County is classified as a frontier county, meaning its population is less than 200,000 people. We have around 44 to 46,000. Our county is 6,200 square miles, 68% of which is public land held by either the state or federal government. Siskiyou, with its seat in Wairika, used to be a net producer of tax revenue for both the state of California and the United States Treasury. Now we are a welfare county. This is due to an agenda which has its roots in the old Green Party agenda. Citizens, taxpayers, property owners in Siskiyou are now victims of the government which is supposed to serve them. Coho salmon, cascade frog, spotted owl are among the target species which have been used against us. Target species form the tip of this environmental sphere. The vast majority of land in our county is not on property tax rolls and therefore cannot be productive in private hands. Government was responsible to pay certain monies in order to make the county productive and have revenue for those lands, which have been taken off the tax rolls by government purchases since the county was formed in 1852. California Department of Fish and Game, for example, owns some 7,000 properties in the state of California, several of which are in Siskiyou County. They're supposed to make payments in lieu of taxes. They have not made these payments in over 10 years. Fish and Game claims they're broke. Federal Timber Harvest Plan called for a certain amount of timber tax to go to the county. These monies were to fund schools and roads, among other things. Using the principle of sue and settle, the U.S. Forest Service has used the spotted owl to effectively stop logging within the county. No logging, no timber.
You're watching Amador County's local television network, TSPN. And now back to Amador This Week.
To effectively stop logging within the county. No logging, no timber tax. One result of that policy is fuel loads far above historical norms, increased transpiration, sublimation. This policy also causes catastrophic wildfires which destroy resources, lives, and the environment. All of this in addition to economic harm caused to the very taxpayers who fund this agency. Environmental NGOs, the agencies like to call stakeholders, have used sue and settle to have the coho salmon listed as threatened in the Klamath River. The result of this is a closure of roads and even more restrictions on logging and the threatened removal of 4 perfectly functional, productive hydroelectric dams on the Klamath River. These dams provide 70,000 customers with the cleanest, greenest, cheapest electricity on the planet. Of course, the taxpayers and ratepayers are already funding this experiment in social and environmental engineering. California Fish and Game used sue and settle with the Karuk tribe and the Klamath River keepers to stop suction dredge mining in the Klamath River. The Cascade frog sue and settle effectively stopped recreation in the high country. Short-nosed suckerfish, which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service tried to poison in the 50s, is now being used to fallow hundreds of thousands of acres of productive farmland in the Klamath Basin. And that land grows food and fiber for this nation. Bureau of Indian Affairs funds the Klamath tribe with taxpayers' money. The tribes use our own money to destroy the economy with the help of federal and state agencies. These are the unintended consequences of the actions of these environmental socialists and their agency friends. The rate of drug manufacturing and naturally drug abuse is soaring. Instances of spousal abuse, child abuse are rising. Elder abuse is on the rise. Our real unemployment is over 20%. County services have been cut, property crimes are on the rise, as is alcohol abuse and drunk driving. Public health and safety are at risk. Siskiyou County is a welfare county now, in some cases a multi-generational welfare county. I have a friend who used to administer the Child Safe program. This is a program where at-risk young children with substance abuse in their family can stay after school and get help, a safe respite, and 1 meal a day. My friend asked an 8-year-old girl what she wanted to be when she grew up. The child answered with all of her beaming pride, "I want to be on welfare like my mama and my grandma." She thinks welfare is a job. My sheriff has had to cut so many positions that he asked law-abiding citizens to pay to go to the Post Academy at College of the Siskiyous, pay for their own equipment, go through training, undergo background physical and psychological testing in order to work for nothing, helping to patrol a county that he can no longer afford to patrol effectively. I'm one of those volunteers. The town of Happy Camp used to be a vibrant, active community with schools, churches, lumber mills, small businesses, Families lived, worked, children grew up, got jobs, and had families of their own. I have heard stories from friends who used to be employed in logging that 180 loads of logs a day went up Highway 96. But let me remind you that a load of logs or a load of alfalfa or gold dredged in the river are exactly what we need to move this country out of the mess we're in. Why? Because these raw materials represent the creation of brand new wealth, real money created out of something that has value. Fast forward 20 years, the town of Happy Camp is almost a ghost town. There is one store, one gas station, it's not manned, drug use is rampant, as is marijuana production. There are no mills left, few viable small businesses, and even fewer people. Drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, property crime are way up. Hopelessness is on the rise as well. And that goes for all of the other towns on the Klamath and Salmon Rivers. Mexican drug cartels are now very active in the mountains of Siskiyou. In fact, they're the only ones using the forest now. Siskiyou County has natural resources in abundance, the type of abundance which could be used to save this country. Abundance which could be used responsibly for generations after generations. Grant money from the welfare state is the only source of income which is reliable in Siskiyou today. One of the big players is the Karuk tribe, the same Karuk tribe who, in conjunction with radical environmental groups and agencies, sued to stop logging. The Karuk tribe is fighting to remove dams. They sued to stop mining. They're actively trying, with the help of NOAA Fisheries, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and U.S. Forest Service, and California Department of Fish and Game, to gain control of surface water rights on the Scott, Mid-Klamath, and Shasta rivers. Yes, I can. So you can call this the Green Agenda, Agenda 21, whatever you want, but the people are tired. The bucket is pretty much dry. So in closing, I'd like to leave you one thought. The difference between a constitutional republic and tyranny is simple. In a constitutional republic, the people wake up in the morning secure in their liberty, their property, and the knowledge that a nation of laws will protect their rights and their ability to live and provide for their families. Under a tyrannical form of government, the people wake up in the morning and ask themselves, I wonder what the government is going to do to me today. Congressman, under what form of government will my family wake up tomorrow?
Finally, I'd like to introduce Mr. Steve Brink with the California Forestry Association.
Thank you, Congressman McClintock and Congressman Nunes, for allowing me to be part of this panel. I've provided 34 pages of detailed written testimony to staff to be included as part of the record for this field forum. I am Steve Brink. My education includes a bachelor's in civil engineering at UC Davis and graduate work in forest engineering at Oregon State. I worked for the Forest Service for 37 years in forest engineering and land management planning, including an assignment right here on the Stanislaus, and 3 other national forests in California. And I've been Vice President of Public Resources for the California Forestry Association for the past 8 years. We are a trade association made up of the remaining sawmills, veneer mills, wood-fired power plants, private industrial forest landowners, and in the woods contractors. I'd like to center my remarks this afternoon on what I'll call a paradox of species-specific habitat designations in a landscape that is fire adapted. Every tree species on the forests of California burn. They're fire adapted. I'll start with the spotted owls and end with frogs and toads. Next slide. In the late 1980s, the Forest Service was harvesting about 1.5 billion board feet from California's national forests. I doubt many know that that was just 1/3 of the annual growth. Since the '94 designation of 18.5 million acres for the northern spotted owl in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, and the standards that were put in place for the California spotted owl for the Southern Cascades and Sierra Nevadas, In the early 1990s, the harvest level plummeted 80% to about 0.3 billion board feet, which is, as you can see, just 7% of annual growth. The harvest level has remained at 7% of annual growth since the early 1990s. And so over the last 20 years, the net growth has added on average about 40 tons of new vegetation per acre to this landscape. As you can see from the graph, the forests grow at the rate of 4.5 billion board feet a year, and only harvesting at 7% has caused them to become overly dense. Next slide. In fact, today, on average, California's national forests average 266 trees per acre on this fire-adapted landscape. To have a resilient forest that can resist insects, disease, and wildfire, the landscape generally can only support 40 to 100 trees. So the paradox I offer, species-specific habitat designations that have led to an 80% reduction in vegetation removal has led to this overly dense forest that has now given way to one of the natural disturbance agents, namely very large wildfires. Next slide. Over the last 20 years, wildfires have increased in size and intensity on California's national forests. Next slide. Today, 1/3 of all acres burned on the national forests in California are stand replacing incinerations, and the trend is increasing. That should be no surprise given the density averaging 266 trees per acre. Just in the last 6 years, on the Lassen and Plumas National Forests alone, 30 spotted owl territories have been incinerated. You don't hear about this from land managers and regulators. In May of 2006, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Regional Director for this region, Steve Thompson, said publicly the primary threat to the owl is catastrophic wildfire. Pure and simple. Of course, wildfire is not the only outcome from these habitat designations. Next slide. The watersheds are degraded. Next slide. All the wildlife suffers. Next slide. And oh yeah, there's air quality issues as well. Next slide. And since 1990, as Randy alluded to, our California rural counties have suffered. Since 1990, the forest sector in California has lost 83 sawmills, 1 pulp mill, 38 wood-fired biomass power plants, and the rural counties have seen forest sector jobs plummet by 24,000 jobs and lose over $800 million annually in payroll to these rural counties. So how has the Fish and Wildlife Service responded? Well, after the 18.5 million acres for the northern owl in '94, this past January, they've designated another 9.5 million acres, of which 2.1 million is in California. Next slide. The blue dots are the known northern spotted owls on the coast. Over 3,000 pairs of identified owls. We suggest last January, the Fish and Wildlife Service should have delisted the northern spotted owl in California rather than another 2.1 million acres of habitat designation. It was back in 1990, during the owl wars, Dr. Jerry Franklin then said, if we had
You're watching Amador County's local television network, TSPN. And now back to Amador This Week.
2,000 pairs of owls, and it was a stable population in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, well distributed. He considered that that would be a viable population. We got 3,000 pairs in Northern California, of which half are in Green Diamond second growth redwood property that is actively managed. Last, for the frogs and toad, it's interesting to me, unless I missed it, Alex did not mention in her testimony the 2 primary causes of the population decline. Number 1, state fish and game putting non-native fish in the alpine lakes, which ate all the amphibians. Second, the chytrid fungus, which is being spread by frog species that are immune to the fungus, but spread all over the place, and it happens to be lethal to the yellow-legged frogs and the Yosemite toad. From what I've read, the frog and the toad are wiped out in Kings Canyon National Park, primarily from the fungus, and they've infected the species that are left in Yosemite Park. So I would think with limited human and monetary resources in the regulatory agency, all the effort should be going towards get the non-native fish out of the alpine lakes and reintroduce the yellow-legged frogs. And by the way, that is occurring as I speak in Desolation Wilderness. And helping the researchers at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley figure out a way to introduce the known antifungal bacteria that would eradicate chytrid fungus without harming the frogs and toads. So the question in my mind has to be, what useful purpose would this habitat designation provide? Thanks.
Perhaps it's a good place to begin, Ms. Pitts. If the principal causes are trout predation and BD fungus, what's the Forest Service, or what's the Fish and Wildlife Service doing to combat the fungus, to combat the trout predation, and how is designating additional critical habitat going to affect those principal causes of the population decline?
So you are correct that chytrid fungus and non-native trout are a significant threat to all of the amphibians, but there are a multitude of threats. Some are stronger and like those.
Well, these have constantly been mentioned as the two principal causes. What's the Fish and Wildlife Service doing to combat them?
The Fish and Wildlife Service isn't authorized to combat those threats. We have to work with our partners.
So instead of going after the principal reasons for these declines, you're going after ancillary reasons that are somewhat questionable according to the testimony we've heard today.
So when we are petitioned to list a species, we're required by the law to follow through with analyzing the best available scientific information and determine whether a species should be listed or not, and the law also requires us.
And that question of best scientific information is open to some doubt at the moment, according to a lot of testimony the Natural Resources Committee has been gathering. Supervisor Handel, the principal refrain we hear from the environmental left is that, well, the critical designation really doesn't impact human activity. One of the mouthpieces of the environmental left in McClatchy said today, it does not directly affect land ownership or establish a refuge or preserve. It does not require private landowners to undertake special restoration or recovery measures. Is this true?
I can only speak to what practice actually takes place. I have some maps that came directly from the Forest Service when they were trying to explain to me why they couldn't do things, and you look at them and they show us the national forest, and they take out, then they talk about the physically suitable, and they take and talk the mature physically suitable, and they start taking more and more land out. They take out wild and scenic rivers and wilderness areas. The next thing they take out is recommended wilderness areas, which you as Congress have not approved. They take those out. Okay? And
What does this mean for private
well, it just means there's
property owners? What does it mean for the public?
the private property owners don't get affected by what the Forest Service does so much, but the critical habitat could.
What does a critical, again, designating all this as critical habitat, what's it going to mean for the economy? What's it going to mean for private landowners?
Private landowners, if they're restricted from managing their land in a suitable fashion, they won't be able to harvest timber on their own land. And that means revenue for them, and it means saw logs for my sawmills, and it means jobs for my people. It just comes down to the same thing. The endangered species becomes the people.
Mr. Brink, what's your view of that allegation that this really doesn't affect public access, it doesn't affect, it doesn't require private landowners to undertake special restoration, it's basically no big deal?
As I tried to point out in my testimony, in my mind, it's a paradox. Every time there's a species-specific habitat designation, the activity on the federal lands decreases. And then, of course, state regulation often follows, just as now we're under a petition in the state government to list an orders foul, which will lead to regulations for the private landowner.
You talked about the devastating effects on both the environment and the economy that the critical habitat designation for the spotted owl had. Are you anticipating the same thing with this critical habitat designation?
I would anticipate, based on the 20 years of history we have from habitat designations, you'd see further decline in activity on the Forest Service lands.
Mr. Baird, on the one hand, the environmental leftists tell us that, and this is from one of the newspapers today, for decades, human activities in these fragile, high elevation areas have caused widespread damage. On the other hand, they assure us that the critical habitat designation will have little or no impact on human activities. Now, which is it? Is it human activities causing widespread damage, or don't worry, we're not going to have any impact on human activities? You can't have it both ways, it seems to me.
Well, historically, all the agencies have a tremendous impact on human activities, regardless of what they say they're doing. For example, the travel management plan just implemented in Siskiyou County. In order to cut wood with a permit there, the tree has to fall across the road because you can't go more than 1 car length from the road with a machine in order to bring the wood. And a lot of people in counties like Siskiyou, they heat their homes with firewood, as do my wife and myself. So without that access to the resource, literally counties where most of the land is in public hands, people can't survive, they can't exist.
And what was the impact of these critical habitat designations in Siskiyou County?
Well, first of all, it strictly limits public access to those lands, and it limits the activities that the public can engage in, and particularly activities that were profitable. And I think what the agencies forget is for these practices to be sustainable, they have to be profitable. No small suction dredge mining. Those guys made a living from that.
I think people are trying to figure out who to believe. We're told on the one hand, this is not going to have any impact on human activity, and on the other hand, what you seem to be telling us is, they told us the same thing in Siskiyou County, and look what happened.
They tell us that on a daily basis. Don't worry, it'll be okay. But I'm here to tell you it's not okay, and it's never going to be okay under this form of management.
Thank you, Mr. McClintock. Ms. Fitz, you started to go into the other reasons that are causing the decline of the frogs and the toads, outside of the fungus that was talked about and the the forest fires. What are the other reasons?
So for Yosemite Toad, we looked at, and I think it was Mr. Brink who mentioned that there are a variety of threats. We go through a very rigorous analysis of the threats, and threats like, or activities like recreation have a low impact for the toad. Activities like livestock grazing have a moderate impact to the toads for its threat. The biggest challenge we're facing with all species in California is that we're facing changes in the amount of snowpack, duration, time of melting. These are all, combined with human activities, are having an impact on habitat for a lot of species.
So, global warming.
Climate change, yes.
Okay. What do you say to the gentleman, I forgot if it was Mr. Wooster, who discussed Yosemite and the frog and toad populations in Yosemite, where there's not any grazing allowed, and I believe it's similarly true in parts of Tulare County, where they created the Sequoia National Monument, where a lot of the grazing is off of those lands. Also, someone mentioned about Kings Canyon no longer having any frogs or toads. So where there's no grazing, so you specifically named outside of the fungus, outside of the forest fires, global warming, and now the issue with the cattle, the livestock grazing. So I have 4 specific reasons that you've said here today. So what do you say about the livestock, where there is no livestock and the populations are declining?
So I'm not familiar with those particular examples, but I can speak generally.
But you're surely familiar with Yosemite National Park.
I am familiar with Yosemite National Park, but I'm not familiar with the particular examples that he cited. What I am, what I am familiar with is that historic human activities combined with a changing climate are having impacts and creating threats for a number of species, including these amphibians.
So, who mentioned the Yosemite National Park? Who did that? Was it Mr. Brink? Okay, so Mr. Brink, could you just clarify, how long have livestock been out of Yosemite National Park?
Oh, I don't know, decades.
I think since it was created in the early 1900s.
Okay, so more than 50 years.
Probably close to 100 years.
Probably close to 100 years. All right, someone from the audience was asking about the mules and the horses that are in Yosemite National Park. Would those have an impact on the frogs and the toads?
I don't.
You're watching Amador County's local television network, TSPN. And now back to Amador This Week.
Any studies on that?
Do horses and mules graze in the park?
Well, there's no livestock grazing in the park. There is allowed pack stock in the park.
But do they graze?
No, well, they eat some grass. But I think, just like horses, cattle don't go in a bog hole where the toads stay. Nobody's going to take their pack horse in a bog hole where the toads are either. So they're going to stand to fly down.
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to say that, I think it's important that we get this on and I know you're working to get this on the official record, but hopefully you can take some of this and get it on the record, because these 4 issues that have been talked about as causing the problems. This is, I think, important scientific evidence enough from my perspective that, this complete process has to be revisited at some point. Because I can tell you, I mentioned this in my opening, when I first went to an event when they were creating the Sequoia National Monument. It was in Visalia, and there was probably, I bet, close to 3,000 people there. And everyone in that building thought that this was the craziest thing, this would never happen, none of this would ever be listed, and the government was going to be there to help them if something did happen. And they're all out of business now, and the park's off limits. And so I think I'm not familiar with Mr. Baird's specific problems, because I've never been up there to that area, but I can tell you that it was replicated in parts of Tulare and Fresno County.
Let's do one more round here. I've got a few more questions. I want to start with Supervisor Hanveld. How many local governing boards are in support of this proposal?
I don't know of any.
How many are in opposition?
I think virtually everybody is.
So
His job is driving things.
Virtually unanimous opposition from all of the locally elected boards that have taken a position on this issue.
That's correct.
We sounded then we've seen both by a show of hands and by applause the overwhelming opposition of the folks in this hall, and this has been an open invitation for all the folks in the region who are concerned or interested in this proposal. Ms. Brink, to what extent does public opinion of the people who are actually affected by these designations enter into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decision making?
So there are different processes for listing and for critical habitat designation. For the listing, we use the best scientific and commercially available data to determine a listing. For critical habitat, there's an opportunity, as I mentioned in my presentation, for comment on an economic analysis. The service performs an economic analysis.
Does the Fish and Wildlife Service take into effect the sentiments of the people who actually live in these regions?
The law requires that we use the best scientific information, and it is a biological determination.
Well, again, what a lot of folks are trying to figure out is whether the Fish and Wildlife Service gives a damn about them in the same habitat. I mean, I appreciate, again, your being here, knowing the sentiments of the community, but I'm looking for some indication that the species that lives here, that used to thrive here, and is now one by one leaving because of the economic impact of the restrictions they're already suffering. I'm talking about the species Homo sapien. Do they enter into these calculations at all? Or does the Fish and Wildlife Service just not care? I mean, it comes down to that.
Well, the Fish and Wildlife Service does care, and what we would really, and according to the plan of a timeline that we established, we anticipate making a decision either to list or not to list, and if appropriate, designate critical habitat by April 2014.
So you would list in the fall, and then would the full 2 million acres be listed as habitat?
No, the economic analysis, the draft economic analysis would come out in the fall. We open another comment period so that people can comment on the economic impacts.
Will you estimate the acreage in the fall? The total number of acres that would be?
Well, so the proposal has acreage associated with it.
So the 2 million is not changing under any circumstance?
That's not correct. So
okay.
if the draft economic analysis would come out on the proposed critical habitat designation. If we were to decide to list, and we designated critical habitat at the time of listing, a decision would be made on what that acreage would look like, depending on the comments that we got, and biological information that we got. We would either keep it the same, make it smaller, make it larger.
But not make it zero.
We're required by the Endangered Species Act to designate critical habitat at the time of listing. In the past, we have not done that on occasion, and we did not fare well in the courts with that. Mr.
Brink, this timeline that Ms. Pitts talked about with the Forest Service, do you agree with that's where the timeline is at, and do you expect, what is your expectation for the folks that here in the audience and for Tom and I to expect how fast this process will move, and what will be the ultimate outcome from your professional experience?
Well, clearly you can see they're on a very fast timeline. If they're going to make the decisions by April of next year, I suggest for the interested parties in the audience and for Congress, you need to be focused on making sure they produce the economic analysis and draft this fall, as Ms. Pitts said they were going to do. Because again, when you look back, the economic analysis drags and drags and drags, and you never see it until they're almost ready to make the final listing decision and any habitat designations. That's what we have to do in the short term, is see that economic analysis, and I can just about guess what it's going to look like, and we need to spend a lot of time responding to it.
But the date is certain, though, by spring, so it doesn't give you much time.
No, not unless, as they did on the draft designation, they may extend the comment period on the economic analysis as well, which would push things back.
Is there any chance that these species won't be listed?
My guess would be no, they're going to be listed. The population declines are significant, and it's because of the fungus and non-native fish, period.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. McClintock.
Just one final question for anybody who can answer it. How much acreage is already designated in this region is off limits because of either wilderness designation, wild and scenic river designation, other critical habitat designations, national monument designations? How much of it's already pretty much off limits?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I can tell you that something like 70 to 80% of the productive forest land, which is where all the activity occurs, is available But because of all of the restrictions, whether it's habitat designations or other standards and guidelines for other species, the Forest Service walks away from over half of the productive forest land when they're trying to produce a thinning or fuels reduction project. They simply cannot produce a project and meet all of their own internal constraints and the regulatory constraints. Over half.
Ms. Pitts, do you have any insight into that?
I don't know what the other agencies have in terms of wilderness designation.
Well, the reason I'm asking is if it's true that half of the Sierra Nevadas are already off limits because of all of these designations or because of current practices, what earthly good do you expect to do by designating even more such acreage?
So I'll just use the Wilderness Act as an example. The purpose of the act is not to protect and recover species. And so that designation does not have an impact on recovery.
But the Wilderness Act forbids a wide range of activities, including grazing, timber harvesting, mechanized, does it not? What are the restrictions on that land, on a wilderness designation?
I would need to have the Forest Service answer that for their lands. I don't have that.
Anybody else?
It's mechanization primarily. When you have a wilderness designation, you're not allowed to use any mechanized equipment. In fact, we had a disabled guy going into Taylor Lake and he got a citation from Forest Service because he was using a wheelbarrow to get his pack down to the lake. So it's the access of any mechanized equipment, chainsaws, motorized vehicles, wheelbarrows, things like that. That's the primary hamper to designated wilderness. But also one other thing that's very important, the Fish and Wildlife Service says that they don't fare well in court over these designations, and that's very true. Because under EAJA, the administrative lawsuits don't have to prove harm. So these agencies like Center for Biological Diversity, all they have to do is sue and say, you're not doing enough to protect the frog. And they don't have to prove any specific harm. And that really needs to be overhauled. That could stop a lot of this.
Mr. Applegarth, you have one final comment, and then we'll go to open mic.
To your point, Congressman, you should know that the El Dorado National Forest has just used the proposed listing of the yellow-legged frog in their closure of 18 high country, high recreation value off-road trails in the El Dorado National Forest. It's a significant economic driver for our county, and we were very surprised to see that the Forest Service was already using the proposed designation to further restrict.
Let me try this right. We're told there won't be any additional restrictions. You're telling us that the U.S. Forest Service is